When we talk about focus, we're not just describing a mental preference or a motivational slogan. Focus is a biological event, a shift in how the brain allocates its limited cognitive energetic resources. At the center of this process is the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for executive functions like decision-making, impulse control, goal setting, and behavioral regulation. When you deliberately pay attention to something, you activate a network of neurons in this region, effectively lighting up the command center of your brain. This activation has a cascade of downstream effects. It boasts working memory, sharpens perception, and suppresses noise, both external distractions and internal chatter. Think of focus as a spotlight. It narrows your field of view so that the relevant information stands out from the background. The more intense the focus, the clearer the signal and the lower the noise. From a neural standpoint, this means fewer wasted computations. Your brain, which consumes about 20% of your body's energy, becomes more efficient, less scattered, and more capable of moving toward meaningful goals. But this process isn't automatic. It requires effort, and effort requires energy. The ability to focus is energetically expensive, which is why it can feel mentally tiring, especially if you're not used to maintaining it. This is where a lot of people falter. They assume that because something feels difficult or mentally demanding, they should stop. In reality, that strain is a sign that your prefrontal cortex is doing its job. It's filtering information, inhibiting irrelevant thoughts, and pushing your system toward goal-directed behavior. There's also a neurochemical basis to this. When you focus intensely, neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and acetylcholine are released. These chemicals heighten alertness and precision, respectively, the signals you give it. They create a kind of tunnel vision for the mind, allowing you to lock onto a task with greater clarity. Acetylcholine, in particular, enhances the brain's signal-to-noise ratio, essentially helping your neurons listen more closely to what's important and ignore what's not. However, this system is easily derailed. If you're constantly distracted, checking your phone every few minutes, jumping between tasks, or multitasking, you never give your brain the chance to enter a deep focus state. You're activating the prefrontal cortex just enough to wear it down, but not enough to actually make progress. Over time, this leads to mental fatigue, reduced willpower, and even structural changes in the brain. The neural pathways associated with distraction become stronger, while those associated with sustained attention weaken. The tragedy here is that most people don't even realize it's happening. They assume their inability to focus is a personality flaw, when in fact it's a neurological adaptation to a chaotic environment. You become what you practice. If you practice distraction, you get better at it. But the opposite is also true. The more you practice focus, the stronger those neural circuits become. The prefrontal cortex, like a muscle, grows with use. And the better it functions, the more control you have over your life. That's the real power of focus. It's not just about getting more done in less time. It's about building the cognitive machinery that allows you to live on your terms. When your executive function is strong, you can resist temptation, delay gratification, and pursue long-term goals with consistency. You can choose what matters rather than being pulled by what's urgent or shiny. In the end, focusing on yourself begins with learning to focus with yourself, on command with intention and despite distractions. This isn't a soft skill, it's a core capability for anyone who wants to live a meaningful, high-agency life. And it all starts in the brain. Distraction is not just a productivity killer. It is a neurological disruptor that erodes your cognitive capabilities over time. When you allow your attention to constantly shift, you dilute the very neural mechanisms that allow you to think clearly, plan effectively, and act with intention. The brain, while powerful, has limited resources. It was not designed for multitasking in the way modern environments demand. Each time your attention jumps from one task to another, from one app to another, from one thought to another, you are forcing your brain to reallocate attention, reset context, and recalibrate priorities. This is cognitively expensive, and more importantly, it weakens your focus circuitry. The prefrontal cortex, which governs concentration and self-control, is especially vulnerable to this kind of overload. When distractions are constant, be they external like notifications or internal like mind wandering, the prefrontal cortex never gets the sustained activation it needs to enter deep, goal-directed work. Instead, neural activity remains shallow and scattered. This results in poor decision-making, impulsive behavior, and a chronic sense of mental fog. You may feel like you're busy or active, but in reality, you're spinning your wheels without traction. Every distraction carries a cognitive cost known as attention residue. This means that even after you've switched to a new task, a part of your attention remains stuck on the previous one. It can take up to 20 minutes to fully reorient after a single interruption. If your day is filled with dozens of micro distractions, your brain never gets a chance to fully lock in. Over time, this leads to a fragmented style of thinking where deep insight, creativity, and sustained progress become nearly impossible. On a neurological level, repeated distraction strengthens neural pathways associated with impulsivity and novelty seeking. Your brain starts to expect interruption. It becomes uncomfortable with stillness and long periods of effort. The dopamine system, which is meant to reinforce meaningful progress, becomes hijacked by quick, low-effort rewards, like messages, clicks. This sets up a feedback loop where you crave more stimulation, but feel less satisfied, constantly searching for the next hit of novelty. What makes this especially insidious is that it feels normal. The modern world is structured to promote exactly this kind of fractured attention. We are surrounded by devices, alerts, and platforms all designed to compete for our cognitive real estate. The average person touches their phone over 2,000 times a day. These behaviors don't seem dangerous, but over time, they rewire the brain in ways that make deep work, focus, and emotional regulation more difficult. To truly reclaim your time and mental clarity, you need to understand that distraction is not neutral. It is a form of cognitive degradation. Every time you give in to an unnecessary interruption, you weaken your brain's ability to sustain attention in the future. This is why setting boundaries around your attention is not just a good habit, it's a neurological imperative. This isn't about eliminating all distractions, which is impossible. It's about managing them with intention. Create time blocks where your phone is in another room. Use tools like website blockers to eliminate easy temptations. Learn to recognize the internal cues that lead to distraction, boredom, fatigue, discomfort, and train yourself to sit with those feelings instead of escaping from them. Just as muscles atrophy from lack of use, the neural networks responsible for focus will wither if not trained. But the good news is that this process is reversible. Neuroplasticity works both ways. By deliberately engaging in focused work, minimizing distraction, and cultivating mental stillness, you can rewire your brain for clarity and discipline and depth. In a world that profits from your distraction, choosing to concentrate is a radical act. It's how you take back ownership of your mind and ultimately your life. Your future depends on your ability to focus. So protect it fiercely. Your brain is constantly adapting to whatever you do repeatedly. This is the principle of neuroplasticity. The brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. It doesn't care whether the habits you build are beneficial or destructive. It simply adapts to what is consistent. This means that every time you engage in a particular behavior, thought pattern, or emotional state, you're strengthening the neural pathways that support it. Over time, these patterns become the brain's default settings. When it comes to focus and attention, this principle has profound consequences. If you consistently spend your time on shallow, fragmented tasks like scrolling through social media, rapidly switching between apps, or consuming low-effort content, you are training your brain to prefer that mode of operation. The neural circuits associated with novelty seeking, passive consumption, and rapid reward become more active, more dominant, and more accessible. Your brain starts to crave short bursts of stimulation, even when those bursts are unproductive or meaningless. This is why it becomes so hard to concentrate on meaningful work after prolonged periods of distraction. It's not just a lack of willpower, it's a rewired brain. You've essentially optimized your nervous system for impulsivity, not discipline. And the more you engage in these behaviors, the harder it becomes to break free. It's not that your brain is broken, it's that it has adapted perfectly to the environment you've allowed it to operate in. On the other hand, if you build habits around focused attention, deep work, and intentional effort, your brain adapts in the opposite direction. The prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning, decision making, and self-regulation, becomes stronger. Neural pathways that support sustained concentration and delayed gratification are reinforced. Over time, what once felt difficult, sitting still, focusing on one task, resisting temptation, becomes more natural. This is not an overnight shift. It's the product of daily repetition and intentional practice, but it is absolutely achievable, and the change is measurable on a neurological level. Consider this: when you engage in a focused task for an extended period, you're not just doing work, you're sculpting your brain to get better at doing work. The neurons that fire together wire together. That means each time you resist a distraction, each time you redirect your attention, you're laying down stronger circuits for concentration. With enough repetition, focus becomes easier, more automatic, and even enjoyable. This is the power of deliberate repetition. And it doesn't only apply to mental habits. It shapes identity. If you consistently act in ways that align with discipline, clarity, and purpose, you start to see yourself as someone who embodies those traits. The brain doesn't separate behavior from identity. It builds identity based on behavior. So if you want to become a focused, high-performing individual, you need to practice those traits daily, even in small doses. What you do repeatedly becomes who you are. If you waste your time, feed your distractions, and chase instant gratification, your brain will support that way of living. If you protect your attention, choose your inputs wisely, and direct your energy toward growth, your brain will support that path instead. The choice is always yours, but the consequences are biological. It's important to remember that this is not about perfection. Everyone gets distracted. Everyone struggles with focus from time to time. The key is to become aware of your patterns and make intentional changes. Start small. 15 minutes of deep work, reducing screen time, journaling your progress. These actions might seem insignificant in the moment, but they compound over time. Your brain is listening. It's always adapting. Every choice you make is a vote for the kind of brain and the kind of life you want to build. What you feed it, it becomes. So the question is simply, are you training your brain for distraction or are you training it for focus? Dopamine is often misunderstood. Most people associate it solely with pleasure or reward. But in reality, dopamine is more fundamentally tied to motivation and the pursuit of goals. It is the chemical signal in the brain that says, this is worth doing again. And here's where it gets interesting. You can train your dopamine system to fire not just when you get a reward, but during the process of working toward it. This shift from outcome-based dopamine release to effort-based release is one of the most powerful ways to build lasting motivation and focus. When you attach dopamine to effort, the act of working itself becomes intrinsically rewarding. You begin to crave progress, not just completion. You start to find satisfaction in the challenge, not just in crossing the finish line. This is a huge mental and physiological advantage because it means you no longer need external rewards or validation to keep going. You've created an internal engine that drives itself. On a neurological level, this happens through a process of reinforcement. If every time you complete a difficult task, you take a moment to reflect on the effort it took, and you feel good about that effort, you begin to associate the strain, the push, the grind with positive neurochemical feedback. Over time, your brain starts releasing dopamine during the E process, not just the result. That's when effort becomes addictive, in the best way possible. This is the opposite of how most people operate. In modern culture, dopamine is often hijacked by passive, low-effort behaviors that deliver quick hits of satisfaction. Scrolling through your phone, binge-watching videos, chasing likes. These actions flood the brain with dopamine, but without any meaningful effort. They create a feedback loop where your brain starts to prefer the path of least resistance. The result, you lose motivation for anything that requires real work because it feels comparatively harder, slower, and less rewarding. What makes this dangerous is that the brain's reward system is trainable. If you consistently reinforce dopamine through easy, effortless activities, you become less tolerant of discomfort and less capable of sustained focus. Tasks that once felt achievable now feel overwhelming. You lose resilience, not because you lack discipline, but because your dopamine system has been trained to expect constant novelty and immediate payoff. Fortunately, the brain is plastic. You can rewire this system, and it starts by consciously shifting your dopamine response away from outcomes and toward effort. For example, after finishing a focused work session or completing a hard workout, instead of rewarding yourself with a dopamine spiking distraction, reflect on the work itself. Say to yourself, literally or mentally, that was difficult, but I did it. That was the win. By doing this repeatedly, you're building a deep association between challenge and satisfaction. Even your language matters. When you say, I have to do this, you frame the effort as a burden. But when you say, I get to do this and I'm stronger because of it, you're reinforcing the value of the process. This isn't empty self-talk. It's neurochemical conditioning. You are shaping how your brain perceives work, focus, and discomfort. The long-term benefit of this effort-based dopamine model is enormous. You become less dependent on external circumstances to feel motivated. You're no longer at the mercy of how you feel moment to moment. You develop grit. You build internal drive. And perhaps most importantly, you reclaim your ability to focus because your brain no longer needs novelty to stay engaged. The truth is, everything you want, every meaningful goal, every skill worth mastering requires effort. By definition, isn't always pleasant. But when you link effort to dopamine, you flip the script. You stop chasing ease and start chasing growth. And that's when real change begins. The center of disciplined behavior lies a specific part of the brain responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and long-term plannings, the prefrontal cortex. This region, located just behind the forehead, is often referred to as the brain's executive center. It's what allows us to override short-term urges in favor of long-term goals. It's also the part of the brain that gives us the capacity for deliberate, goal-directed behavior, what most people refer to as self-control or willpower. But while the prefrontal cortex is incredibly powerful, it is also highly trainable, meaning that its function can be strengthened or weakened based on how frequently it is used. The prefrontal cortex doesn't operate in isolation. It works in constant coordination with other brain systems, especially the limbic system, which governs emotion, and the basal ganglia, which handles habits and routines. When there's a conflict between what feels good in the short term and what's beneficial in the long term, the prefrontal cortex is the region responsible for resolving that conflict in favor of your goals, if it's strong enough. But if this part of the brain is underdeveloped, fatigued, or not engaged, impulsive or habitual behavior often takes over. Training the prefrontal cortex involves repeatedly placing yourself in situations where you must choose effort over ease, focus over distraction, or long-term benefit over short-term pleasure. Each time you resist a distraction and return to the task, you're engaging and reinforcing prefrontal activity. Each time you push through resistance instead of giving up, you're strengthening the circuits responsible for persistence and follow-through. And each time you reflect on your actions and make an intentional choice rather than operating on autopilot, you are building what neuroscientists call top-down control, where the prefrontal cortex regulates lower, reactive parts of the brain. Interestingly, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until well into your 20s, and even after that, it remains sensitive to training. Unlike many brain regions that become less plastic with age, the prefrontal cortex retains a degree of adaptability throughout life, especially when consistently challenged. This means that no matter your age or background, your capacity for discipline can grow because it's grounded in a biological system that can be shaped through experience. Discipline becomes easier not because the task changes, but because the neural systems responsible for managing effort and attention become more efficient. Functional MRI studies show that individuals who regularly engage in deliberate, self-directed routines tend to have stronger connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the brain's reward and emotional centers. This enhanced connectivity means they are better able to evaluate the consequences of their actions and to downregulate emotional impulses in real time. In practical terms, it means the decision to stay focused, to delay gratification, or to keep pushing through challenge becomes less mentally taxing over time. However, the strength of the prefrontal cortex is also influenced by lifestyle. Chronic stress, poor sleep, and overstimulation, especially from excessive digital input, can weaken its function. This is why consistency in sleep, exercise, mindfulness, and even nutrition plays a critical role in sustaining discipline. These aren't just wellness habits, they are physiological supports for the very system that governs your ability to act with intention. In essence, the prefrontal cortex is the neurological foundation of discipline. It's the system that transforms intention into behavior and behavior into identity. The more often you engage it, by making difficult choices, resisting easy outs, and committing to effort, the more responsive and reliable it becomes. Over time, it stops feeling like you're pushing against yourself and starts feeling like you're being led by a clearer, stronger internal compass. That's the mark of a well-trained prefrontal cortex, and it's at the heart of what makes discipline sustainable. Brain doesn't change through action alone, it changes through repetition and relevance. These two forces, repetition and salience, drive the reinforcement of neural circuits. When it comes to building discipline, it's not enough to do something hard once and feel accomplished. What truly rewires the brain is engaging in effortful behavior repeatedly while assigning high emotional and personal significance to those behaviors. This combination strengthens specific neural pathways and makes the disciplined action more automatic over time. Let's begin with repetition. Every time you perform a behavior, you activate a series of neurons. If that behavior is repeated consistently, those neurons begin to fire in more coordinated ways. Over time, the connections between them, called synapses, become more efficient. This process is described by the phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. The brain, in essence, becomes better at doing whatever it does most frequently. This applies equally to focus, procrastination, persistence, or distraction. The circuitry you reinforce through action is the circuitry that dominates your behavior. But repetition on its own can lead to either progress or stagnation. If you're repeatedly engaging in avoidance or distraction, you're still wiring your brain. You're just wiring it for weakness. The key to wiring for strength is making sure the repeated behavior aligns with a deliberate identity and is practiced with awareness. And that's where salience comes in. Salience refers to how emotionally relevant or meaningful something is to you. From a neurological perspective, salience activates the limbic system, particularly regions like the amygdala and the insula, which are involved in emotional tagging. When you engage in a behavior and simultaneously feel a strong emotional response, such as pride, frustration, triumph, or even discomfort, that emotional intensity tells the brain this matters. And when something matters, the brain pays closer attention, and plastic change is more likely to occur. When repetition and salience are combined, you create a kind of learning multiplier. You're not just going through the motions, you're imprinting. For example, pushing through a workout when you don't feel like it is beneficial. But pushing through while consciously reminding yourself that you're building resilience and while feeling the emotional gravity of choosing effort makes the behavior more memorable and the neural encoding deeper. That's when you start not just doing disciplined things, but becoming someone who identifies with discipline. In this way, every disciplined action becomes an opportunity to shape identity. The brain doesn't separate who you are from what you do. It builds your sense of self based on patterns of behavior that carry emotional weight. If you repeatedly act with discipline and feel a sense of integrity or alignment with your values, as a result, your brain learns to associate effort with internal reward. That association becomes a driver of future action. This also explains why many people fail to develop discipline despite doing the right things. They don't emotionally engage with the process. They approach effort like a chore, something to endure rather than something that defines them. Without salience, repetition becomes mechanical, and mechanical repetition doesn't leave a lasting trace in the brain. To change, the brain must care. You have to link the behavior to something meaningful, whether it's your identity, your goals, or your values. One practical way to increase salience is through reflection. After each act of discipline, take 30 seconds to acknowledge it mentally or verbally. That was difficult, but I did it anyway. That's who I'm becoming. This reflection adds emotional resonance and flags the moment for deeper encoding. You're signaling to the brain that this was not just another moment. It was a meaningful moment of growth. Ultimately,